been a pretty hectic few days in Ukraine, even for a country in the middle of a major war. Last night, May 8th, saw the largest single Russian drone attack launched against Kyiv since the start of the full-scale invasion. Used in this attack were the Shahed or Goran-style drones. Same thing, two different names. The Shahed is the Iranian name and the original source of this munition. Goran then are the Russian manufactured variants. Overall, they're one and the same. Roughly 60 of these were launched at targets all across Ukraine last night, with 36 targeting Kyiv. Ukraine announced that they shot down all 36 around the capital, but I haven't seen a tally of overall success across the country. And a few notes on this. First, a 100% success rate is well within the realm of possibility. Kyiv is now a hardened target when it comes to air defense. They have assets in place based on very recent events and are constantly expecting to use them. These Goran-style drones are slow, like 185 kilometers per hour, which sounds fast, but in the air defense game, it's a relatively easy target. Most of these are being launched from inside of Russia rather than Belarus, and Ukraine is aware of the incoming strike usually before those munitions cross into their airspace. But even if they had no idea it was coming until it entered Ukrainian territory, that's over 200 kilometers from Kyiv. That means they've got more than an hour to get ready, man their positions, bring up extra ammo, and start watching the skies. Even when Russia launches these from the north inside of Belarus, that's roughly 100 kilometers away. That gives Ukraine at least 30 minutes to prepare to engage. On top of that, the slow speed and limited maneuverability with these drones makes them susceptible to anti-aircraft cannons rather than just missiles. Now, there have been some reports of Ukraine running low on some of their old Soviet stock of medium-range air defense missiles, but these drones are usually engaged with cannons and machine guns with pretty regular success. A clip came out last night showing a little bit of both. In this video, you'll see the tracers from air defense cannons as well as an air defense missile actually engaging a target. So in the background here, you'll see a detonation. There we go. You can see the tracers flying across the sky. And eventually, an air defense missile coming up, turning, and engaging a target at relatively low altitude here, which is supposedly one of the Shahed or Goran-style drones. Now, even with a 100% success rate over Kyiv, that doesn't mean there won't be casualties and damage. When hit, it's not like these things self-destruct and turn into nothing. It's a big piece of equipment still falling from the sky. These Shahed drones weigh around 440 pounds each, so last night, that was the equivalent of 30 motorcycles hurling down at a major population center. Even if they don't detonate on impact, which some still may, that's going to cause some serious damage. It is still somewhat early to have all the details, but the last I heard, there were 5 people wounded in this attack, and there's not a lot of information out in terms of damage to any sort of critical infrastructure. It is a little surprising to see Russia continue to sling drones into Kyiv given the mounting likelihood of a Ukrainian offensive. I mean, why not strike military targets, right? Now, giving Russia the benefit of the doubt here in terms of planning, it's possible these strikes are designed to pin Ukrainian air defenses to major population centers, preventing them from being forward deployed near the front. And to a degree, that's happening. Every volley of drones forces that decision. I mean, there's a finite amount of air defense assets, and obviously some are still operating in and around Kyiv. The counter to that strategy is that Ukraine is largely able to neutralize the drone threat with more modest means of air defense and are likely saving their more advanced systems for use against Russian missiles. At this point, when even Russia is openly discussing the potential Ukrainian counteroffensive, it's hard to imagine that the largest drone attack in the war isn't somehow tied to the overall military objectives. Of course, a major challenge that Russia has had since the opening of this war is the synchronization between their air and land forces. The two have largely operated independent of one another, so there is the off chance that the head of the aerospace forces for the war in Ukraine, Sergei Surovikin, made this decision without regard to the larger context. Sticking with Surovikin now, the previous commander of all Russian forces in Ukraine, he's right back in the spotlight now in regards to this drama around the Wagner group. This has been a complete headache to track. So Wagner is the private military company run by Yevgeny Prigozin. They've been fighting for Russia in the east of Ukraine for a little over a year now, and as of late have gotten a lot of attention for their assaults on Soledar and Bakhmut. They've been in the middle of some of the heaviest fighting, and over the last 8 months have taken more territory and have likely caused more Ukrainian casualties than any other part of the Russian army, and I don't think it's close. So if you're Russian and you're looking for any form of success since the lines have largely stabilized last fall, the Wagner group is who you're looking to. The challenge here for Putin and Russia, but probably a net win for Ukraine, is that Wagner isn't a part of the Russian Ministry of Defense. It's a company, sort of a privately owned company, but also really tightly connected to the Russian state. That opens the door for some rifts, and holy cow, have they been on display. Now, a few months back, Prigozhin put out a video saying that Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was withholding ammunition for his men. He said it was causing unnecessarily high casualties and showed the bodies of some of the fallen Wagner fighters. That level of calling out your boss publicly is not the most popular means of communication in any military, and Russia's no different, but it seemed to have worked, at least to a degree. It appears that that initial plea got Prigozhin enough ammo to keep up the fight at Bakhmut for a few more months. Then just as Wagner is closing in on the last few kilometers at Bakhmut, he blew up again. Prigozhin put out 3 noteworthy videos over the last week or so. The first was with a pro-Russian military blogger named War Gonzo. I talked about that in a previous video. In that interview, he said that if Wagner didn't get more ammunition and soon, they might have to consider falling back from Bakhmut so they're not caught at the front, unable to fight. It's kind of a shot across the bow, and by itself is a pretty serious bomb to drop, but that was just the beginning. Then Prigozhin put out another video, and this one was a real banger. He showed the bodies of dozens of dead Wagner soldiers, and he yelled into the camera at Shoigu and Gerasimov, calling them some pretty colorful names in a way that's going to be pretty hard for him to walk back. And before the dust settled on that one, he put out a third video, all kitted up in front of his men, saying that Wagner would be withdrawing from Bakhmut on May 10th. He gave the 10th as a date so as to not interfere with the annual Russian Victory Day celebrations on May 9th. Now, as you can imagine, this caused a little bit of chaos, and before long, Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, said that his men would be taking up the fight at Bakhmut, replacing Wagner. There was even a letter drafted by Kadyrov to Shoigu asking for an order to do just that. Now, real quick, just so we're clear here, the biggest battle and the biggest war we've seen in generations, and the fight is transferring from a private military company to a group of Chechen fighters. Kind of makes you wonder where the Russian army is. There has been significant VDV or Russian airborne participation in and around Bakhmut for a while now, but it's the one-off style units that are taking point in the biggest fight of the last 8 months. That's odd. On the one hand, you could say the Bakhmut fight is producing so many casualties that Russia wants to keep their organic forces out of it. But on the other, it raises some speculation that Russian forces are fully deployed all across the front. There may not be sufficient Russian forces in reserve to take on the fight at Bakhmut, at least not in the near term. But it turns out we're going to have to wait and see how Kadyrov and his men would do in Bakhmut, because after all of this, Prigozhin announced that he would be getting the necessary ammo and that General Surovikin would be serving as a go-between from Wagner to the Russian Ministry of Defense. So at the very least, that behind-the-scenes movement appears to have at least dialed down tensions. I mean, as of today, May 8th, the fighting around Bakhmut still continues. Okay, so first off, this was not a psyop by Prigozhin to try to trick Ukraine. This whole episode lasted like 72 hours, and we're back to, I guess, now a new normal. Even if Ukraine had taken that bait of the Wagner withdrawal on the 10th, Prigozhin already walked it back. Part of me thinks this is Prigozhin trying to sell high, if you will. As of now, it's his Wagner group that has seen the most success in Ukraine, but there's a lot of talk about what this counteroffensive could look like and where it'll be. It's not crazy that Prigozhin and his men are set up to attack, but maybe not to defend, especially against a sustained armored attack. It's worth noting real quick that there have been some reports of an anti-tank guided missile shortage amongst Russian forces, including Wagner, in and around Bakhmut. And that's going to be a problem if Ukrainian armored columns start coming down that road. So by putting the blame on Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense, Prigozhin could be wanting to take credit for the success of Bakhmut, but limit his exposure if it's retaken by Ukraine. Even now, I think that's a possibility here. The most likely, however, is that it's just messy, and that one of Russia's key figures in this war has a short fuse and a hot temper. Wagner may have been cut off from additional ammo, or maybe it was a mistake, or maybe that didn't happen at all. Prigozhin has gotten what he wanted a few times by making a public display of the issue at hand. That just might be how he's adapted to this current strange chain of command he's operating within. Whatever the reason you think for his recent outbursts, I'm sure it won't be the last. Prigozhin called out senior Russian leadership and threatened to essentially walk away from the front in the middle of a major battle. That personality is going to be a major challenge for Russia to deal with going forward, and probably add some high-level infighting inside of Russia that's going to benefit Ukraine in the long run.